That rusty car doesn't belong here, the billionaire CEO said with a smile that drew laughter from the crowd. 10 minutes later, not a single person in the room would be laughing. The annual Sterling Automotive Heritage Gala was the kind of event most people only saw in magazines. Beneath towering crystal chandeliers, some of the rarest automobiles in America gleamed beneath carefully positioned lights. Vintage Ferraris, handcrafted Bugattis, and one-of-a-kind European classics stood like works of art on display for collectors willing to spend millions of dollars for a piece of history. The scent of polished leather and expensive cologne drifted through the ballroom, while conversations about investments and exclusivity floated through the air. It was a world built on status, appearance, and reputation. Ethan Calloway felt none of those things belonged to him. He guided his aging pickup through the crowded parking area outside the convention center and turned off the engine. The truck rattled slightly before settling into silence. Beside him, his 10-year-old daughter Lily looked through the windshield toward the luxury vehicles lined up across the lot. "Wow," she whispered. "Every car here looks brand new." Ethan smiled. "Not every valuable thing looks new, sweetheart." Lily grinned. "That sounds like one of your dad lessons." "Maybe it is." He stepped out of the truck and walked toward the covered trailer attached behind it. Inside rested a vehicle most people would have dismissed without a second glance. The paint had faded decades ago. Small patches of surface rust covered parts of the body. The interior showed the wear of countless years. To strangers, it looked forgotten. To Ethan, it was family. His late father had spent years preserving it. Ethan had spent years protecting it. As workers opened the trailer, several nearby attendees glanced over and immediately exchanged amused looks. One man chuckled. Another shook his head. A woman quietly covered her smile with a champagne glass. Ethan ignored them. He had long ago learned that dignity rarely required a response. Inside the gala, Victoria Sterling stood at the center of attention. At 38, she was already one of the most influential automotive CEOs in the country. Reporters followed her. Investors listened to her. Industry leaders competed for her approval. Her confidence filled every room she entered. When she spotted the weathered Ferrari being rolled into the exhibition area, she stopped mid-conversation. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Who approved that entry?" she asked. One of her executives glanced toward the car and laughed softly. Apparently some local mechanic brought it. Victoria studied the vehicle from across the room. Against the backdrop of flawless million-dollar restorations, the old Ferrari looked painfully out of place. She crossed the floor in elegant heels, drawing attention wherever she went. The crowd naturally parted for her. Ethan was adjusting a display placard beside the car when her shadow fell across the concrete floor. "Sir," Victoria said politely enough for the audience listening nearby, "I think there may have been a misunderstanding." Ethan looked up calmly. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "This exhibition is for collector-grade automobiles." Her eyes moved across the faded body panels. "Not restoration projects waiting for a scrapyard." A ripple of laughter spread through the surrounding crowd. Lily lowered her eyes. Ethan remained perfectly still. The overhead lights reflected softly across the worn hood of the old Ferrari. The room buzzed with amusement. Victoria waited for embarrassment. Instead, Ethan simply smiled. "That's interesting," he said quietly. "My father used to say people reveal more about themselves than about the object they're judging." For the first time, Victoria's smile faded slightly. Then something caught her attention. Near the edge of the open engine compartment, hidden beneath decades of age and dust, she noticed a small marking. It was barely visible. Most people would have missed it completely. Victoria took one step closer. Then another. Her confident expression slowly disappeared. Because suddenly, she wasn't looking at a rusty old Ferrari anymore. Victoria Sterling had spent her entire career reading details that other people overlooked. Tiny manufacturing flaws, hidden market signals, subtle design cues that separated an ordinary automobile from a masterpiece. That was why the marking beneath the engine compartment unsettled her. It was not the symbol itself. It was where it appeared. She leaned closer. The conversations around them softened into a distant murmur. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across polished chrome, while collectors continued drifting through the exhibition hall, unaware that the most powerful woman in the room had suddenly forgotten every other car on display. "Do you recognize something?" Ethan asked calmly. Victoria did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the faded marking hidden near the engine block. "Where did this car come from?" she finally asked. Ethan folded his arms. "My father. And before him. I never asked." Victoria straightened slowly. Something about that answer felt genuine. Most collectors would have launched into a rehearsed speech filled with provenance and exaggerated stories. Ethan simply stood there without any need to impress anyone. Lily watched the exchange nervously. A few minutes earlier, those same people had been laughing at her father. Now the CEO who controlled billion-dollar companies looked genuinely uncertain. The shift was subtle, but Lily noticed it immediately. Children often notice things adults missed. Victoria glanced toward one of her senior restoration experts, standing across the hall. "David," she called. The gray-haired specialist approached quickly. "I need you to look at something." David bent toward the engine compartment. Seconds passed. Then his forehead creased. "That is unusual," he muttered. "Very unusual." Victoria crossed her arms. "You see it too?" David nodded slowly. "I do." Nearby guests sensed something changing and began drifting closer. Curiosity spread through the room faster than conversation. Ethan remained still. The attention did not seem to affect him. In fact, he appeared more comfortable standing beside the worn Ferrari than he had standing among wealthy collectors. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that did not need recognition to exist. Victoria found herself studying him almost as much as the car. His shirt was simple. His hands carried years of honest work. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. Yet he carried himself with a dignity that many executives spent fortunes trying to project. "Would you consider selling it?" Victoria asked suddenly. Ethan smiled faintly. "No." The answer came so quickly that several people nearby exchanged surprised looks. Victoria was not accustomed to hearing that word. "You have not heard my offer." "I do not need to. Everyone has a number." Ethan glanced toward Lily. "Not everyone." For a brief moment, silence settled between them. The fluorescent spotlights reflected softly across the aged Ferrari. Somewhere in the distance, a champagne glass clinked against another. Victoria looked back at the strange marking one more time. The longer she stared, the more questions appeared. Questions she could not answer. Questions that should not exist. And for the first time that day, she felt something entirely unfamiliar. Not confidence. Not control. Curiosity. Because if that symbol meant what she feared it might mean, then the rusty Ferrari sitting in front of her was not the story. The real mystery was the quiet single father who had refused to sell it. The gala ended hours later, but Victoria Sterling could not stop thinking about the car. Long after the final guests had left and the exhibition hall had gone dark, the image of that faded marking remained fixed in her mind. From the top floor of Sterling Automotive Tower, the city lights stretched across the skyline like scattered stars. Her office windows overlooked nearly 3 million square feet of commercial property, yet her attention remained on a rusty Ferrari sitting inside a modest trailer somewhere beyond the city limits. She sat behind her desk and opened a secure database used by collectors around the world. Thousands of records appeared. Historic race cars, limited production prototypes, factory archives, restoration reports. Nothing answered the question she carried home from the gala. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Ethan Calloway was back where he felt most comfortable. The small garage behind his house smelled faintly of motor oil, aged wood, and summer rain drifting through an open window. Lily sat on a stool nearby, finishing homework while Ethan carefully covered the Ferrari with a protective cloth. "Do you think that lady was angry?" Lily asked. Ethan smiled. "I think she was confused. Because you would not sell the car? Maybe." Lily looked toward the covered shape beneath the garage lights. "Would you ever sell it?" Ethan paused. His hand rested lightly on the fender. "No, not even for $1 million. Not even for 10 million. Lily laughed softly. "That sounds crazy." Ethan looked at the car for a long moment. Some things are worth more than money. Back in the city, Victoria finally made a decision. The next morning, before sunrise, she assembled a team of specialists. Historians, restoration experts, archivists, and collectors. By noon, dozens of photographs taken during the gala had been enlarged and displayed across a conference room wall. David, the restoration expert, studied one image carefully. "The placement is wrong," he said. "If that marking is authentic, it should not exist on that engine." Victoria folded her arms. Meaning either somebody created the most convincing forgery I have ever seen, He stopped. Or we are looking at something nobody knows about. Silence settled over the room. One expert shook his head. Impossible. Another disagreed. Rare does not mean impossible. Victoria listened carefully. Her instincts told her something important was hidden beneath years of dust and mystery. For the first time in her career, she felt less like a CEO and more like an investigator following a trail. That afternoon, she instructed her assistant to contact Ethan. The call came while he was repairing an old pickup truck for a customer. "Mr. Calloway," the assistant said politely, "Miss Sterling would like to discuss purchasing your Ferrari." Ethan tightened a bolt and wiped his hands with a shop rag. "No, thank you." The assistant sounded surprised. "You have not heard the offer." "I do not need to. Miss Sterling is prepared to be very generous." Ethan smiled faintly. "That is kind of her." "Then is that a yes?" "It is still a no." Across the city, Victoria stared at the phone after hearing the response. Most people chased wealth. Most people chased status. Yet the quiet single father had turned down her offer without hesitation. And somehow, that made the mystery surrounding him even harder to ignore. 3 days passed, and Victoria Sterling became increasingly frustrated by something she had not experienced in years. She could not buy an answer. Every resource available to her company had produced more questions than conclusions. Historical registries revealed no record matching the unusual marking. Factory documents from the 1960s contained gaps where information should have existed. Even retired Ferrari historians disagreed with one another. Some claimed the symbol was impossible. Others insisted they had seen references to something similar decades earlier. Meanwhile, Ethan Calloway continued living exactly as he had before. Every morning, he opened his garage at 7 o'clock. Every afternoon, he picked Lily up from school. Every evening, he worked beneath the soft glow of workshop lights, while classic country music played quietly from an old radio. The contrast could not have been greater. One person commanded billion-dollar corporations. The other repaired alternators and brake systems in a small-town garage. Yet somehow, Victoria felt as though Ethan possessed something she could not reach. Late Thursday afternoon, a black luxury sedan rolled into the gravel parking lot outside Ethan's shop. Several customers looked up from their vehicles as Victoria stepped out. Her tailored business attire seemed almost out of place beside pickup trucks and weathered toolboxes. Ethan glanced up from an engine bay and immediately recognized her. "You drove all this way to hear no again?" he asked. Victoria almost smiled. "I drove all this way because I do not believe the answer is no." Ethan closed the hood and wiped his hands. "Then you drove all this way for the wrong reason." A few customers exchanged amused looks before returning to their own conversations. Victoria noticed something unexpected. Everyone seemed to respect him. Not because he was wealthy. Not because he was famous. Simply because he treated people well. It was the kind of respect that could not be purchased. "What if I am not here to buy the car?" she asked. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here?" Victoria paused. For the first time, the truth felt easier than strategy. "I want to understand it." The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot. A warm breeze carried the scent of cut grass from nearby fields. Ethan studied her carefully. Gone was the mocking CEO from the gala. In her place stood a woman searching for answers. "You really want to know?" he asked. Victoria nodded. Ethan looked toward the old Ferrari visible through the open garage door. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked toward a dusty cabinet mounted against the back wall. Inside were boxes, folders, and photographs collected over decades. He removed a worn leather journal and placed it gently on a workbench. The cover showed years of age. The edges were faded. "My father kept this," Ethan said quietly. Victoria stepped closer. "What is it?" "The reason I never sold the car." He opened the journal slowly. Between yellowed pages rested sketches, engineering notes, old photographs, and handwritten entries dating back more than 50 years. Victoria's pulse quickened. One photograph immediately caught her attention. It showed a younger man standing beside the Ferrari in Italy. Next to him stood several engineers. One face had been partially obscured by time and sunlight. Yet even through the faded image, Victoria recognized him instantly. Her breath caught. Because the man standing beside Ethan's father appeared to be Enzo Ferrari himself. Victoria stared at the photograph as afternoon sunlight filtered through the garage windows. Dust floated through the golden beams while the sounds of distant traffic faded into the background. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The image looked ordinary at first glance. A group of engineers standing beside an unfinished vehicle. A workshop in northern Italy. Smudges of grease on work clothes. Faded smiles. Yet one face changed everything. "That cannot be real," Victoria whispered. Ethan looked down at the photograph. "That is exactly what I said when my father first showed it to me." She carefully lifted the picture from the journal. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a date from more than 50 years earlier. Beneath it was a short note. "To my friend Thomas. Thank you for seeing possibilities where others saw limitations." Victoria read the sentence twice. Then a third time. "Thomas was your father?" Ethan nodded. "Thomas Calloway." The garage seemed quieter than before. Even the old radio had drifted into static between stations. Victoria turned another page. More sketches appeared. Technical drawings. Engine notes. Prototype measurements. Beside many of them were handwritten comments from multiple people. Some signatures were difficult to read. Others were completely illegible. Yet one signature appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. "My father never talked much about those years," Ethan said. "He always believed the work mattered more than recognition." Victoria slowly lowered the journal. That sentence stayed with her. In her world, recognition was everything. Companies fought for headlines. Executives competed for attention. Entire industries revolved around visibility. Yet the man whose work might be connected to one of the most significant automotive discoveries in decades had apparently spent his life saying almost nothing about it. "Why keep all this hidden?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "Because that is what he promised." Victoria frowned. "Promised who?" Ethan carefully turned to another page. Tucked between the sheets rested an old letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Fold marks crossed the center. Ethan opened it gently. "My father told me this letter mattered more than the car." Victoria listened as he read. The letter described an experimental project. A small group of engineers. Ideas that never reached production. Concepts considered too ambitious for their time. Near the bottom appeared a final sentence. "Great achievements belong to history. Character belongs to the person." Ethan closed the letter. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The words seemed to linger in the air. Then footsteps approached from outside. Lily entered carrying 2 cold lemonades from the diner down the road. "Did I miss anything?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Only a little history lesson." Lily handed one drink to Victoria. "Dad says history is mostly stories people forgot." Victoria accepted the cup. The simplicity of the statement made her smile. Across the garage, the covered Ferrari sat beneath soft afternoon light. For years she had believed the car was the mystery. Now she realized something far more remarkable. The real mystery was how a man connected to such an extraordinary legacy had chosen a life of quiet dignity instead of fame. And as she looked at Ethan standing beside his daughter, she began to understand why every answer she uncovered only seemed to deepen the question. The following week unfolded like the slow approach of a storm. What had started as a private curiosity inside a small-town garage was becoming something much larger. Victoria Sterling used every legitimate connection available to her, not to acquire the Ferrari, but to uncover the truth behind it. Archivists from Europe reviewed photographs. Retired engineers examined copies of the journal. Historians compared dates, signatures, and manufacturing records. With every new discovery, the mystery deepened. Then came the call that changed everything. Victoria was standing inside a conference room overlooking downtown when David entered carrying a folder. His expression alone told her this was different. "We found something," he said quietly. Victoria looked up immediately. "How certain are you?" David placed the folder on the table. "Certain enough that I think the entire collector community deserves to see it." Inside were newly recovered documents from a private archive in Italy. Several references matched names found inside Thomas Calloway's journal. More importantly, one internal memorandum referenced an experimental engine program that had never been publicly disclosed. Victoria sat down slowly. "This is real." David nodded. "I believe it is." By the end of the day, Victoria made a decision that surprised even her closest executives. Instead of making another offer on the Ferrari, she announced a public historical verification event. Independent experts would examine the vehicle. Archivists would present evidence. Collectors, journalists, and historians would be invited to observe. Everything would happen in the open. No private negotiations. No corporate ownership claims. Just the truth. When Victoria personally drove to Ethan's garage to explain the idea, he listened quietly. Lily sat nearby eating a chocolate milkshake from the diner. "You want to put the car in front of the entire world," Ethan said. "I want to put the truth in front of the entire world," Victoria replied. Ethan looked toward the old Ferrari. The afternoon light reflected softly across its weathered body. For a moment he thought about his father, about the years spent protecting something he never fully understood, about promises made long ago. "And if the experts decide it is nothing special?" Ethan asked. Victoria smiled gently. "Then nothing changes. And if they decide it is extraordinary?" She paused. "Then nothing important changes either." Ethan studied her carefully. For the first time, he believed she meant it. 2 weeks later, the exhibition hall was fuller than it had ever been. Television cameras lined the rear walls. Collectors filled the seats. Historians occupied the front rows. The air buzzed with anticipation. Yet amid all the excitement, Ethan remained remarkably calm. He stood beside Lily near the Ferrari while guests whispered theories throughout the room. Some expected a historic discovery. Others expected an embarrassing mistake. Victoria stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. The room gradually settled into silence. Bright lights illuminated the vehicle at the center of the floor. Then the first expert approached. Another followed. Then another. One by one, they began examining details hidden beneath decades of dust and age. The audience leaned forward. Reporters lowered their voices. Cameras focused tighter. And as the investigation officially began, nobody noticed that one elderly historian had suddenly frozen beside the open engine compartment, staring at something that made the color drain from his face. The elderly historian slowly removed his glasses and stared into the engine compartment as if he had seen a ghost from another era. The crowded hall fell quieter with every passing second. Reporters stopped whispering. Cameras shifted toward him. Even the other experts abandoned their own examinations and moved closer. Victoria stood near the stage, watching carefully. "Professor Bennett," she said. "What is it?" The historian did not answer immediately. His hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward a section of the engine hidden beneath a removable panel. "Please tell me nobody touched this before today." One of the restoration specialists shook his head. "Everything has remained exactly as found." Professor Bennett swallowed hard. "Good." The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan remained beside Lily, calm as ever. Unlike everyone else, he was not chasing a revelation. He was simply honoring a promise made long ago. The historian carefully leaned forward. Years of experience showed in every movement. Then he revealed a small engraved section hidden beneath decades of grime and oxidation. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. The engraving was unmistakable, elegant, precise, personal. Several experts immediately stepped closer. One adjusted a flashlight. Another examined archival photographs. A third compared the engraving against authenticated samples stored in a digital database. Silence stretched across the exhibition center. The giant room that had been filled with excitement only moments earlier now felt almost sacred. Finally, David looked up. "It matches." Nobody reacted at first. The statement seemed too significant to process. Victoria blinked. "Matches what?" David exhaled slowly. "The verified handwriting samples." Professor Bennett nodded. "Every curve, every angle, every detail." One journalist stood. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" The historian looked toward the audience. "I am saying this engraving appears authentic." A murmur swept through hundreds of spectators. Cameras flashed. Collectors exchanged stunned glances. Yet the surprises were only beginning. Another expert opened a folder containing documents recovered from Italy. He compared serial references found inside the journal with markings hidden throughout the engine assembly. One after another, the numbers aligned. Independent verification followed. Then another. Then another. Each confirmation made the conclusion harder to dispute. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. For weeks, she had pursued a mystery. Now she was watching history reveal itself in real time. The Ferrari was not simply rare. It appeared connected to a confidential development project that had never been publicly documented. A forgotten chapter hidden for more than half a century. Then Professor Bennett said something that transformed the room entirely. "The vehicle has historical value beyond estimation," he said quietly. "But that is not what impresses me most. He turned toward Ethan. Most people would have sold this years ago. Most people would have turned it into fame. Most people would have spent decades telling everyone who they were. Ethan simply smiled. My father taught me that character matters more than recognition. The elderly historian lowered his head respectfully. Around the hall, people who had once laughed at the rusty Ferrari found themselves looking at Ethan differently. Not as a mechanic, not as a collector, not even as the owner of an extraordinary automobile. They saw a man whose quiet dignity had preserved a piece of history when no one else knew its value. And as Victoria looked across the room toward Ethan and Lily, she realized that the greatest discovery made that day was not hidden inside an engine at all. The event ended with applause, but the quiet that followed stayed with Victoria Sterling far longer than any standing ovation. As guests slowly filtered out of the exhibition hall, she remained near the stage, watching Ethan and Lily prepare to leave. Reporters wanted interviews. Collectors wanted photographs. Investors wanted meetings. Yet Ethan politely declined them all. Thank you, he told one journalist. But we have a long drive home. The reporter looked stunned. Most people spent years chasing the kind of attention now being handed to him. Ethan simply wanted to get his daughter home before bedtime. Victoria found herself smiling as she watched Lily climb into the passenger seat of the truck. The contrast was almost impossible to ignore. One of the most talked about stories in the automotive world had just unfolded around them, and yet their evening looked exactly like any other family evening. Before Ethan started the engine, Victoria approached the truck. The parking lot lights cast long reflections across the pavement. Leaving already? She asked. Ethan nodded. School starts at 8 tomorrow morning. Lily grinned from inside the cab. And I have a math test. Victoria laughed softly. That sounds more important than television interviews. Dad says most things are. Ethan gave a small shrug. She is not wrong. For a moment, nobody spoke. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain drifting in from the countryside. Somewhere beyond the parking structure, city traffic hummed in the distance. Victoria looked at Ethan differently now. The arrogance she once felt around him had completely disappeared. In its place was something she had not expected. Respect. Real respect. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Ethan seemed surprised. For what? Victoria glanced toward the truck. The first day we met. Ethan smiled faintly. You judged a car. No, she replied. I judged a person. The honesty in her voice left no room for excuses. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. Everybody gets things wrong sometimes. Not like that. Especially like that. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. For years, she had built a career around making quick judgments. Most of the time, they were accurate. This time, they had not been. Yet Ethan carried no bitterness, no desire for revenge, no need to prove anything. The realization struck her harder than any public embarrassment ever could. Character really was different from reputation. One could be manufactured. The other had to be lived. Lily leaned forward from the passenger seat. Dad always says second chances matter. Victoria smiled warmly. Your dad sounds smarter every time I meet him. Ethan laughed quietly and shook his head. The sound surprised even him. As the truck pulled away, Victoria remained standing beneath the parking lot lights. She watched until the taillights disappeared into the darkness. Then she looked up at the night sky and realized something remarkable. The mystery that had consumed her for weeks was finally solved. The signatures were real. The history was real. The legacy was real. But none of those discoveries explained why she could not stop thinking about the quiet single father who had never needed any of them to know his worth. Autumn arrived quietly in the weeks that followed. The excitement surrounding the historic discovery gradually settled into articles, documentaries, and conversations among collectors around the world. Yet in the small town where Ethan Calloway lived, very little seemed different. Every morning, he opened the garage. Every afternoon, he picked Lily up from school. Every evening, he worked beneath the familiar glow of workshop lights. The Ferrari remained exactly where it had always been. Covered, protected, respected. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan was repairing an old pickup truck when a familiar black sedan rolled into the parking lot. He looked up and smiled before the engine even stopped. Victoria Sterling stepped out carrying a cardboard box. There were no reporters, no executives, no cameras, just her. Lily spotted her through the office window and immediately ran outside. You came back. Victoria laughed. I did. She handed Lily the box. Inside were books about automotive history, engineering, and design. Lily's eyes widened. These are amazing. I thought you might like them. Ethan watched the exchange with quiet appreciation. Victoria had changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the sharp edges she carried when they first met seemed softer now. They spent the afternoon talking beside the garage. No negotiations. No business deals. Just stories. Stories about Ethan's father. Stories about Lily's dreams. Stories about mistakes, second chances, and lessons learned the hard way. As the sun slowly lowered across the horizon, Victoria finally turned toward Ethan. You know, she said, people still call me every week asking if you will sell the car. Ethan chuckled. I figured they might. Some of the offers are ridiculous. That is what Lily says too. Victoria smiled before growing serious. Can I ask you something? Ethan nodded. When everyone learned what the car was worth, why did nothing change for you? The evening breeze moved gently through the trees surrounding the property. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime softly rang. Ethan looked toward the garage where the Ferrari rested beneath its cover. Then he looked toward Lily sitting on the porch reading one of her new books. Because my father never measured value that way, he said quietly. He taught me that respect, character, and family are the things that stay with you. Everything else comes and goes. Victoria lowered her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she smiled. It was not the confident smile of a billionaire CEO. It was the grateful smile of someone who had learned something important. As darkness settled over the town, she prepared to leave. Before getting into her car, she turned back one final time. You know, she said, the funniest part of this whole story is that everyone thought the most valuable thing here was hidden under that hood. Ethan followed her gaze toward the garage and smiled. They were wrong. Victoria nodded. Completely wrong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed unusually still. Then she climbed into her car and drove away. Ethan stood beside Lily and watched the taillights disappear down the road. The Ferrari had made headlines. The signature had stunned experts. The discovery had captured international attention. But none of that was what people remembered most. What they remembered was the quiet single father who never needed wealth to feel valuable, never needed recognition to know his worth, and never stopped choosing dignity when everyone else was looking at appearances. And in the end, that was the only legacy that truly left the world silent.